Subject this evening is standardized testing and how our schools have become obsessed with it, the damaging effect that it's having on kids, teachers, families, and society as a whole, and what can be done about it. To lead the discussion, we're delighted to have with us Anya Kamenetz. When I asked her how she pronounces her last name, she told me that there are scores or dozens at least of you out there, so I hope I pronounced it correctly. As a number of you already know, she's been an education writer for more than a dozen years since graduating from Yale, and has written several books about the future of education. Last year, she became the lead education blogger for NPR. In her new book, The Test, Anya makes clear just how dire the testing situation has become. For one thing, preparing for tests and taking them now consumes more than a quarter of classroom time for our kids. Many exams end up asking the wrong questions, and the results are often being used in the wrong ways. Tests also are turning kids off to school and turning teachers off to teaching. And Anya warns the next generation of tests are likely to make matters even worse. After spending the first half of her book describing this disturbing state of affairs, Anya devotes the second half to offering some solutions. She pulls together lots of informative and interesting material in very accessible ways, reflecting both her skills as a journalist and her sensibilities as the mother of a young girl. As the Boston Globe reviewer wrote, the value of what Anya has written, quote, lies in her ability to avoid the soapbox style of too many books on education reform today. The Globe Review went on to call the book, quote, a perfect entry for parents who are too deep in the muck of testing to have the clarity of distance. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Anya Kamenetz.
Thanks so much for that warm introduction, and it's such a pleasure to be back here at this amazing bookstore for I think the third time with this book. And as you mentioned, I've got a lot of family members here tonight. I also have a number of colleagues here supporting me from NPR, and my representative, Dustin, who works with me. I've worked with him for almost 9 years. And I thank them all very much for the effort that they all made to get here in the cold, and all of you in the cold. It's really, really remarkable. And I was just reflecting on this today that, there's a lot of worthy, I'm in a unique position in the jobs world, in the sense that every once in a while I get to walk up to a podium and get applause for what I do. And there aren't a lot of jobs that get that kind of recognition. And it is very humbling to be in that position. And I want to reflect back that everybody that I know who's here does incredibly worthy work as well that doesn't always get that kind of recognition. And I'm sure all of you are in that position. Well, maybe some of you get all the recognition you want and deserve, and I hope that you do. But but for those of you who don't, thinking about then the different kinds of rewards that come to different kinds of work, because I come in for my share of criticism too, and that's part of the job. But thinking about the different kinds of rewards that come from different kinds of work is in some ways the topic of what I'm talking about tonight, because we know that we have a diversity of gifts in this world, and we know that there's seems to be a broad consensus that America, in our best moments, we want to have a broadly diverse, competitive, and open society where people are able to achieve and accomplish and create and innovate, and they're not stymied by artificial barriers like their background or where they came from, or race, creed, sexual orientation. Any of those things should not be barriers in the way to pure grit, pure determination, talent, and the ability to collaborate and create. That's the kind of society that we are in our best moments. But for some reason, we seem to have, along the way, lost our way, and in the pursuit of something that looks like an objective determination of merit or achievement, we have decided to make our schools and our students accountable for weak, limited, and standardized measures of very small set of skills. And that is what we're holding our students to, by and large. That's what we're holding our schools to, and that's what we're holding our teachers to. That's what we're holding our districts to, and our states. These weak, limited, outdated measurements of math and reading skills. That's what, the science tells us that they're outdated. And the psychometricians who create them will tell you that they're limited. They were never meant to be used in the way that they're being used today as a single high stakes measurement. And the psychometricians who are honest with you will also tell you about their weaknesses as well. And so I'm sure there's a shelf of prep books in this bookstore that will talk about how to exploit their limitations and their weaknesses, because these are games. Tests are games, and tests can be gamed. And so the mismatch that we're talking about here between the kind of society that we want to cultivate, the kind of people we want to cultivate, the kind of kids we want to raise, and what we're holding our schools accountable for, that is a gap that I'm talking about. And we hear a lot about the achievement gap, but I want to talk about the expectation gap and the measurement gap, and the difference between what we want, what we hope for, what to hope to achieve, and what we're actually measuring. And as the business maxim goes, you manage what you measure, and so you better be damn sure that you love the measurements that you're using, because that's exactly the outcome that you're going to get. I could take it from there in a whole bunch of different directions. I kind of want to hear what people in this room have to say. But just to give you a little bit of the background of why I came to write this book, my last book was about innovation in the higher education world. It was about a number of different forces converging to create an atmosphere where people felt like change was going to come. The economics of higher education were changing. Student loan debt was growing. Access was becoming an issue, not only for us, but all around the world. People were clamoring for more and more access to higher education. So the cost was an issue, the quality was an issue, and then the relevance was an issue, because in many places, in many parts of our economy, skills were advancing faster than syllabuses or curricula could catch up with them in the higher ed space. So I wrote a book about this transformation in higher education. I talked about self-directed learning, about web-enabled learning, about changes and adaptations that institutions were making, and new kinds of institutions. And it was a lot of fun. I toured around as an educational futurist and met people starting different kinds of initiatives, and worked with the Mozilla Foundation on a book about web-enabled learning, open learning. And it was all well and good. And then I had a kid, and I had to suddenly think about the rest of education, which until then I just occasionally would get a question about it at a Q&A session. Well, what about K-12? And I'd say, I don't know. But now all of a sudden it's a problem. I have a kid. I have to educate her, or think about how to educate her, or maybe I'll keep her home from school. I don't know what I'm going to do, right? And so I said, okay, well, I'll write DIYU K-12, and it'll be all about the great innovations that are going on in the schooling world. And I was in touch with the unschoolers and the homeschooling movement, a lot of great innovative private schools, the maker movement, mind shift, game-based learning, technology, device-driven one-to-one schools, project-based learning, expeditionary learning. Are these buzzwords you guys are familiar with? Yes, no, maybe. It doesn't matter. The point is, it was really cool stuff. There's really great connected educators, teachers out on Twitter, talking to each other, sharing resources, information. Amazing stuff going on in the world of K-12. I wrote this proposal. I talked to my agent, and he said, this is like tiny. I didn't even know what you're talking about. Like, none of these innovations have broken through into the mainstream. This is happening over here in homeschooling. This is happening in private schools. Maker spaces are this like tiny thing, like a school garden, but a space where students can create and just have, tools to work with. Why aren't you talking? Why isn't this stuff breaking into the mainstream? This doesn't seem convincing to me, if it's so great. And I said, well, he'd invite me up to his apartment, because he was like, I know you've got a book in you. I just don't know what it is. This is not it. And I said, Jim, like, the problem, I guess, is that what public schools tell me is that they have to give these standardized tests and hold kids accountable for the outcomes, so they just don't have that much time to experiment with all this other stuff. It's all kind of around the margins. And he said, well, I think you kind of have to write about that. That's the problem. You just identified the problem. You can write about the solutions and the great stuff that's going on, but you really have to write about the problem too. And so that led me into this territory that I had avoided for so long, talking about and thinking about No Child Left Behind, about A Nation at Risk, about Sputnik, about the 19th century schooling system in America, and obviously unavoidably political debates on the right and the left, and now Race to the Top, the Common Core. Luckily, as I finished my tuition on these issues, learning from so many people in this space, as I wrapped up the book, I got a call from NPR, and they said, we have a position for an education reporter. We know you know about higher ed, but do you know anything about K-12? And I said, yeah, now I do. Okay, great. So that was the impetus for this book. It's been really, really fascinating to delve into it. I think, when you write about higher education, it's connected to the world of scholarship, the world of ideas. It's an international kind of issue. Writing about K-12 education, it's unavoidably personal and it's unavoidably political. I think what I've come to see is that our nation's public schools are really this interface point where the state meets the individual, and families have to figure out what they want to have happen with their kids, but then we're also figuring out as a nation what kind of schools we want to have. And so it inevitably is tied up with questions of race, class, gentrification, urbanism, equality, inequality. So it touches on all these kind of fascinating threads above and beyond learning and teaching and pedagogy, which is what we would like schools to be about. But obviously they end up being mixed up with all these other things. Those are my general comments. Like I said, I think the Q&A is really going to be the most fruitful because I want to hear from you all what you are curious about and what you find most valuable. But I guess the final thing that I had to say about why I wrote the book and who the book is meant for, I heard from a friend who also has a young child who said, this book brought me an enormous sense of relief because I'm very nervous about exposing my kid to rote learning and having his creativity be destroyed. But now I see that there are alternatives and there are solutions, and that's worth a lot to me. So it's worth a lot to me too. I think in order for us to have a positive vision of change of our schools, we kind of need to know what that vision is. Again, I think I'm going to leave it there. I really want questions. I want this to be a dialogue.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know if this is something that your book goes to or not, but I'll try the question. So, if you go into a public school in the District of Columbia at the high school level, you've got a teacher who's responsible for 5 classes of 28 to 32 students each, and standardized testing on a regular basis. If you go to a private school, you've got classes of 10 to 15 students, and you've got faculty who usually have 1 or more advanced degrees in their topic, and are able to provide a steady stream of feedback on every assignment. So people with the resources generally buy the private education, and their kids end up with world-class educations. And people without the resources or with an ideological commitment to public education send their kids to classes of 30 kids or 40 kids. Why are the public schools not taking a lesson in quality from what people pay for beyond their taxes?
So there's 2 information points I want to push back on the premise of your question. One is that large-scale research and evidence shows that public schools perform on par with private schools as a group. And in the area of math scores in particular, which One large-scale study argued was a more important measurement than reading skills because reading skills are more closely tied to the home environment than math skills. If you look at math skills alone, public schools outperform private schools as a group, despite all of their disadvantages and everything that they do. And the other point of the data to push back on is, as a group, public school teachers are more qualified and more educated than private school teachers. And the third point that I want to make that is in the process of researching the book, I came across a group of high schools in New York City and New York State called the Performance Standards Consortium. When New York State converted to the All Regents diploma, which is a diploma for which you have to pass a series of subject tests, and it used to be offered as an honors option. Now it's the default graduation in New York State. I'll pass all these Regents exams. This group of schools, which had been a project learning oriented group of schools, said we don't want to do this. They got a special exemption. Now there's 28 schools in the group. They don't give standardized tests in high school. They are demographically identical to similar urban public high schools. Yet they have a much improved graduation rate and a much improved college retention rate. And I think the statistic that the director of the consortium, Ann Cook, was so delighted to point out to me more than anything was the retention rate of the teaching force at those schools, that the way that teaching and learning was organized at schools that did not give tests led to a very high commitment level and a very high level of engagement and happiness, let's say, amongst the teachers because they were put in charge of their students' learning and the determinations of their students' learning. As part of the research for the book, I was able to be part of a performance evaluation. And what that meant was a high school student named Michaela came and met me for coffee, and we talked about Pride and Prejudice for an hour. And then I gave notes on our conversation. And it's unbelievably informal. I mean, they gave me almost no feedback on how to do it. And there was a rubric, but their teacher said, you know, the rubric is there for the state, but we don't really need it. I just need to hear, like, your description of our conversation. And what I heard, but on the back end, you got Michaela spending a year reading this book, talking to her tutor about it, watching every adaptation that's ever been made of this book, derivative works, Clueless, you know, and developing her ideas across a group of related disciplinary courses to the point where she sounded like a graduate student giving a presentation and was able to discuss the book with me on all these different theoretical levels over the course of 40 minutes and was confident and forthright and completely above her years in terms of her personal presentation. And this was just one of many qualifying exams that she had to give in order to graduate high school.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Since it seems pretty clear that the results on these standardized tests are just often demonstrate the fact that families are selecting schools based on the reputations of those schools, and towns and states like New Jersey where, you know, the quality of the school district determines who's living there and who's not. Wasn't the whole genesis of making this big push towards standardized testing not to say that this school's failure or this school's doing great, but rather a year-over-year comparison of whether the school is getting better or worse after the families have already self-selected for what school district they want to live in, and is that working or not?
It depends on who you ask. I mean, part of my argument in the book is that the tests are kind of a crude instrument, and also that they are they have so many different consequences attached to them that they kind of lose. You don't really know. I mean, the same test, in other words, is being used in a way that the psychometricians never intended, which is an instrument of accountability for the individual student and for the teacher and for the school and for the district. And so one of the kind of messes that they're trying to disentangle now is this idea that we used to rate, No Child Left Behind rated schools as failing based on the brute force number of students that were proficient, that passed the middle mark on the test. In an affluent district, it's very rare for students to fall below proficient. And so they hit the ceiling on that test pretty quickly, and it's difficult to get any useful information from the same test, any useful information on the improvement or the worsening of that school, because the kids were all doing pretty well before and they're all doing pretty well now, and this test is not specific enough to tell me that. A test could tell, some tests could tell you that. So, and for example, there's been various attempts to take the PISA test, which is a non-high stakes sampling-based international comparisons test, and use it to see if even affluent kids in America are doing as well as kids in other developed countries. And the answer has been probably not, at least not on that test. And again, you have to take my whole point in this is let's consider the source and how good is this data. And some people argue, well, the PISA test in the United States is not as big a deal as it is elsewhere. The kids maybe aren't trying as hard. We just don't really know. Could a test be used that way? Yes, it could be.
That's how it was designed, or it was designed to just say these schools are failing and they need to be brought up.
Designed by who? Is the question. I think. Well, I would say this. I would say most of the rhetoric around the designing of No Child Left Behind policy stressed the performance of the disadvantaged groups and of minority groups, and No Child Left Behind is about the kids that might have been forgotten before, or we didn't pay enough attention to their performance before. It wasn't about making the great ones even better as much. They didn't talk about that as much.
Well, your reference to the PISA test, I guess, is what got me on my feet.
Okay.
And I guess this is a multifaceted question to some extent, which is other words for saying I have more than one question.
All right.
But it's really kind of trying to look at American education in more globally, and say,
Sure.
and thinking or believing on the basis of what I read and so forth that the U.S. doesn't do very well K through 12 and PISA, that is internationally.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do very well. But on the other hand, we have a higher education system that's often called, sort of a model for the world, and especially a graduate education system that's probably even more commonly thought of as a model for the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we have an economy that's pretty strong compared to the world, at least right now, and that's kind of frequently the case.
Right.
So I'm trying to understand the disconnect between, if there is a disconnect between standardized testing K through 12 and the performance, and even internationally. So there are a couple of questions. Is there a disconnect? Does it mean that the standardized testing doesn't, certainly doesn't appear to end up hurting our higher education system, nor the economy? So part of the question is, well, one would be, are we being outcompeted at our own higher education system and maybe within our own economy from people coming here from other countries who have the benefits of an education system that, on the basis of standardized testing, would seem to outperform our own K through 12 at least? Is there any evidence that we're being outcompeted, at our own, that we've, gone to a lot of effort to create, a sound higher education system, and that we successfully innovate, for sure. One of the fears that the K through 12 standardized testing sort of approach to things is thought to be, maybe an obstacle too. I don't know. Can you get into this a little bit? And first of all, do you know of any evidence that we're being outcompeting ourselves, that our kids are being outcompeted in their entrance into our own education system, or for that matter, the world's higher education system, and then outcompeted or at any disadvantage with respect to making their way in the world. I don't know.
So, one of the major questions in my book is, do standardized tests in fact capture everything about what makes America great? And I think there's a lot of evidence that they don't capture everything about what it is that makes America great. And then a corollary to that is, standardized tests have been used historically to reinforce a message of failure and to create a lot of anxiety around failure. And that actually narrative goes back to the 1840s in Boston when Horace Mann, a great education reformer, introduced a really difficult essay test into the Boston public schools to create anxiety around failure. They published the results of the test and they said these schools are terrible, these teachers are terrible, and we should take over and institute, Horace Mann's, great exemplary progressive at the time, very lauded historically, now also policies, but the means by which he used to inculcate them, at least in Boston, maybe not so laudable, but certainly a template for how tests have been used since then. So we have anxiety around failure. Tests don't capture everything about what makes America great. Are we being outcompeted? The international comparisons always puzzle me. I know they're red meat. People love international comparisons around education. They love them around business as well. I feel like, America should be competing with itself. We are the open nation. We are the open society. People come here to create and to build. We have the levels of entrepreneurship. We have the innovation and the research. And the premise of my book is, and there isn't just one best way to win. Like, there are lots of different ways to win and to succeed. And China's got one model, and we have another model. And I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yes, thank you. I am a public school teacher at a middle school in Montgomery County, science at a science magnet. We just had
Thank you.
Thank you. It's the first time I've ever been applauded for that.
That's right.
We just had a staff meeting Monday, and we were just told what the new testing regime would be for our school and other schools. I would assume it almost doubles the time over the prior years.
Wow.
I asked a fellow teacher of mine, who I'm very close to, if she would like to come to this talk tonight, because I assumed you were actually going to talk about the argument against all this, but you haven't yet.
Okay.
So she said, no, why should I? Because we've been told what we're going to have to do, and that's what we have to do. Mm-hmm. So one of my questions would be, what would you say to her? The second one would be, I don't understand when you were going through all the acronyms of all these alternative programs, KIPP and others that you could list, why the public schools are immediately discarded. If you pick up any of the science journals in education, you'll see every month incredibly innovative programs coming out of public school education.
I don't think
American
I did.
biology teachers, National Biology Association, National Science Association. Those are actually coming from teachers who have designed, I know because I just did one and had it published. Mm-hmm. So I don't, I think that we're maybe blanketly underselling what actually is going on. We're a science magnet, and yet from our art department, we have students regularly winning in extremely advanced art competitions all over the state. They're in libraries, they're posted, and so on and so forth. I see things like that all the time, and so I just kind of get a little concerned when those kind of statements are made that there's nothing happening there. Maybe those schools don't have the overbearing weight of the testing. I don't know. But testing is also only one part of it. I've seen after the years that I've been here, and our school's gotten better and better. We are now so highly sought after that we're overcompeted for slots 3 times. So I'm not speaking in generalities here. Mm-hmm. When our students apply to the high school science magnets, test is one thing, teacher recommendation letters are another, and their grades are another. It's a 3-way pendulum that's looked at for that. It's not all based on a one standardized test. So I just wondered what you would say to teachers in my situation and my colleagues where this is coming, we've been told we're going to do it, and yet, there's still an attempt to innovate, to improve, to practice, and the school is showing it can do that.
I would say right on, keep doing what you're doing. And the innovations and the things that I talked about in my opener were not confined to private schools or to charter schools. Makerspaces, Connected Educators, Project-Based Learning, to name 3, are very well represented in the public schools. And, I did not mean to imply that. And in my answer to the other gentleman, I see many amazing things happening in the public schools. What I don't see is those amazing things getting recognized as much, or getting, I don't see schools being held accountable for that kind of achievement and that kind of innovation. I don't see a community of innovators being raised up and celebrated outside the schools. I see schools being tested and punished for those tests. And you asked me to make the argument against testing, and my first chapter of my book is called 10 Arguments Against Testing. So I'm just going to read them, and we can call them as read, and I'm happy to expand on any one of them. Here's the case against high-stakes standardized tests in math and reading as currently administered annually at nearly every public school in the nation, 3 through 8, plus once in 10 through 12. Number 1, we're testing the wrong things. Number 2, tests waste time and money. Number 3, they're making students hate school. They're turning parents into preppers. Number 4, they're making teachers hate teaching. Number 5, they penalize diversity. Number 6, they cause teaching to the test. Number 7, the high stakes tempt cheating of all kinds at all levels. Number 8, they are gamed by states until they become meaningless. Number 9, the tests are full of errors. And number 10, the next generation of tests will make things even worse.
So say agreed. Thank you. This is not an applause part, but just for background, I've taught in DC public schools for 15 years. I have 3 kids in DC public schools. I say this, every school I've taught in has been labeled by other people as failing. I never have perceived that myself in any school that I've worked in or with my colleagues. That's not to say there aren't a lot of problems, and I think that we all kind of can acknowledge and know what those are. So with the list that you just read, it's like we know those things now. Yeah. And I work in a charter school that I would say used to be considered one of the most progressive charter schools in the city. It's been around for a long time. And for a while, I think we pretended we could do both.
Yeah.
Yeah, like we could do expeditionary learning and we could do this. And then we can keep this going. And then it was like, well, let's cut out a little bit of the expedition in order to get a little more in. Yeah. Every year it's a little more, it's a little more. As a teacher, it's exhausting to be asked to do both.
Yeah.
And I don't want to do both.
Yeah.
I don't want to do this other part. And I guess my question as a parent and a teacher then is like, how do we stop it?
Yeah.
Right? Because like it's good to have all of these ideas. Like it's like so we know what what we want, but this feels like something that is almost unstoppable at this point. I think the lack of teachers in this room is because everybody's exhausted trying to do these things. So any insight on how we might stop it? And I there's organizations, but where you see that sort of going in the next few years.
Can I follow up on that? Because mine kind of goes with that.
Sure.
Because I'm an educator in DC public schools as well.
Great.
So I work with math and science teachers. I've actually taught math all across the country, California, Minneapolis, tons of different places, seen lots of different systems. I would actually say you're 25% into, focused on testing is a little low. Like, I mean, it's in the fiber of everything we do every single day. It overruns everything.
Right.
Like that's every meeting, everything is around it. But in the stopping, what I give on the side is my non-official advice to friends and family who have kids. I'm like, I would refuse to have your kids take the test until they were in high school. Yep. Like, what are your thoughts? Do you think that if everyone refused to have that done until they're in high school, when the child could actually rationalize that it's something that they could, that it would work?
Listen, the opt-out movement is growing. There are a chapter in this book profiles a teacher, a student, and a parent involved in organizing the opt-out movement. I profiled Jeanette Deuterman, who is the leader of Long Island Opt-out Info. 22,000 children opted out of tests last spring in Long Island alone, 60,000 across New York State. And her group backed and elected 16 school board candidates across Long Island, 6 of whom were outsiders who challenged incumbents. This is a very effective organization. And they are allies. They've formed the New York State Allies for Public Education, making common cause with teachers' unions and other groups that have similar concerns, not only about testing, but about testing-driven reform agenda around choice, around, what people call market-based reform or privatization, you know the names, and said this is a national issue, this is a political issue, and this is what we want to organize on. This is a state issue. So that is a path that is open to people, and refusing has consequence. I have a piece coming out in the Washington Post where I talk about the legal arguments about opting out, but the consensus right now really seems to be that it's an act of civil disobedience, and that it can be very powerful, particularly in a situation. And for Jeanette, it was a personal decision because she had a son with severe school anxiety, and that went away when she started organizing, and he realized that his family was on his side, and he didn't have to do this.
Hi. I happen to agree. I mean, I don't like the standardized testing either. And for my child, I'd be happy. Well, he's out of college now. But my concern is like disadvantaged children here in D.C. that I know were falling through the cracks. Mm-hmm. I'm not certain it's better now. I think it is, but I don't know that it is. So I guess my question to you is, do you know if it's better for those kids that really aren't getting what they need at home for whatever reason? And is there an alternative way of testing, perhaps?
Right. So this is the most commonly used argument in favor of accountability. Test-based accountability came in on an equity argument. And the No Child Left Behind argument was, the real kind of genius or, in the design of No Child Left Behind was that it required schools to report not only average performance, but performance of minority subgroups broken out by subgroup, African American, Hispanic, learning disabled, English language learner, and low income. And so you couldn't hide those kids behind the average. That was the sort of idea. And, the conversation about equity is getting stronger and stronger. I think, there's, well, actually, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if I can say because I wasn't around during the time of Brown versus Board of Education. That was a pretty strong conversation about equity in schools. And the remedy that was applied then was about desegregation. And in some cases, it was about a war on poverty. If we war on poverty and we desegregate schools, we will achieve equity. Well, the rhetoric for the last 15 years has been if we test children more, we'll achieve equity. And schools now are no less segregated than they were before we started. And in the case of the charter school movement, many cases, those schools are more concentrated in terms of race and in terms of poverty than the public schools alongside them.
So do you have a solution to that?
I think that we don't have to, in designing a new kind of accountability system, and this is not my solution, this is the solution of many theorists and great educational thinkers, you don't lose the goal of equity in trying to design a new system. You try to define equity in a way that is measurable and yet is not a single rigid standard that you try to get every kid to match up to. And so multiple measures is kind of the baseline idea. Some people think that longitudinal measures are really strong. The idea that you can track it, now we have statewide longitudinal data systems, that gets people nervous for a whole bunch of different reasons. But staying with this idea, if you have a school district and you have students and you're tracking those students from their prenatal care to their neonatal care, did they get home visits? What was the literacy like? Did the mother get arrested? Was she pregnant another time? Then she got into, what was his status when he got to preschool? Was he suspended from preschool? How was kindergarten? How was his reading? How was his math? How was his times he was sent home? How many times it was all the way up into the workforce? And then you make this communities accountable to that kid.
Like the 0 through 3 programs, that type of thing?
I mean, I'm talking about 0 through workforce.
Yeah. But maybe put more focus when the kids are really young. Well,
in terms of resources, yeah, but I'm talking about the data collection that you're doing all along the way. And so equity never goes away, right? But the tools that you're using to examine that are different.
Right. Okay, thank you.
There's an old joke that has a guy going into a delicatessen in New York, and he sees a Chinese waiter who speaks perfect Yiddish, and the boss tells the guy to shut up because he thinks he's learning English. And that's a huge problem with this. The standards of learning actually should be the standards of understanding. The persons who come from other countries have already been culled. The other extreme are the Tsarnaevs who are now into big trouble in Boston. So it really, realistically, the magnet schools have also culled students by examination. So I personally would suggest that the standards of learning be changed to standards of understanding.
Hi. I'm also a teacher in Montgomery County, and when the new superintendent came in, he said that one of his 3 major goals was to increase social and emotional intelligence in the schools.
Joshua Starr.
Yeah. And I was like all over that, and I volunteered my services, and eventually I found out that that goal has been put on the back burner because there's so much pressure to do much better on the standardized testing. Mm-hmm. So I just wondered, from your knowledge base and all the research you've done, if you've come across much research on social and emotional intelligence and what you have to say about it.
Yeah, I have. I interviewed Joshua Starr, and he told me that he wants his kids to be great students and wonderful people, and if he'd had to choose, he'd rather that they were wonderful people, and he wants the schools to reflect that. And he's distinguished himself as a national advocate of multiple measures and of social and emotional learning measures. So it's upsetting to hear that that agenda is not trickling down to the schools, or at least is not being felt as strongly. What's really interesting about the move towards social and emotional learning, and I talk about this in the second half of the book, I describe 4 new approaches to testing, and one of them is monkey measures, which I call measures of social and emotional skills. But what's really interesting about them is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, James Heckman, and a MacArthur Genius Grant award-winning psychologist, Angela Duckworth, and many, many, many other researchers out there in the very hard-nosed social sciences have brought us the news that being a wonderful person is just as important as being smart. Seriously, right? No, seriously. Half the skills you need for success are what is called sometimes non-cognitive skills, social emotional skills, mindsets and essential skills and habits. Half of what you need for success. And none of it is being measured in our current accountability system or accounted for. And measuring it is not simple. These are complex. For example, if you're going to measure someone's empathy, I talked to someone about this, does a doctor have empathy when they're caring for a patient? Well, how do you know? Well, empathy is an X factor that comes into a decision-making process where they have to consider their own needs, they have to consider the patient's needs and the broader context, and then there's empathy in the sense of how do they communicate that decision? Are they listening? Does the person feel heard? How do they work with the other people on the team? It's really multidimensional. But it turns out psychologists have been dealing with this complexity for a long time, and one instrument that they developed is large-scale surveys. And surveys such as those given by the Gallup organization, they do a Gallup student poll. 875,000 students took it last year. It asks things about hope, engagement, and well-being. Things like, how do you feel about coming to school every day? Is there someone at school who cares about you and your success? And they've been doing hope, engagement, and well-being. They've done it on 20 million people in the workplace originally. And so they have a lot of information about correlation. This is not a high stakes. It's never been high stakes. It would be absurd to give high stakes in a survey like this. But correlationally, if you have highly engaged employees, your company makes more money, right? It's a strong correlation. And correlationally, that's not a word, but if you have highly hopeful students, they do really in high school, they do really well in college. And the level of hope predicts how well they do in college better than their SATs, better than their GPAs. On this one survey, this is a 20-question survey. So this could be a potentially powerful, very strong implement. There's another, school climate surveys are a little more, they can also collect data around things like, what is the discipline records at the school? How many times are kids getting punched at the school? How many times are kids getting arrested at the school? What's attendance like? This tells you something about the social and emotional climate of a school. He brought in and out because when they look at factors like toxic stress, you're looking at community factors around crime and around the environment and other issues that really impact into the school community. So if you have a shooting 2 blocks from your door, that's going to impact the kids' achievement and their emotional health and well-being. And so sometimes, even though we don't have the finest tuned instruments to measure these skills, we do have the ability to gather enough information about the environment that can cultivate them.
What did you say was the name of that twin question?
It's the Gallup student survey, and I believe students in Montgomery County take it.
Hi.
Student poll, sorry.
I have worked in schools for 46 years, and I'm now running a charter school here in D.C., a school that has an average class size of 16 and whose racial demographics mirror those of the city. And unlike most public schools in this city and nationally, ours is a racially integrated school. It's a good thing that we care about education. We all care about education. We will have a faculty meeting next week where we will talk about Park. And we will have to tell the faculty that we will spend most of the spring testing students. And we're always trying to strike the balance between, and as a charter school, we appreciate having the autonomy we have. But we want to do well enough on the standardized tests that they'll leave us alone so we can focus on the things that we really want to focus on.
Yep.
So my question is, we have a lot of people who care about education. We have a lot of very gifted people in this country.
Yeah.
Why is it we are flailing around? And if you had 60 minutes with Arnie Duncan, what would you recommend?
Oh, that's a great one. I hope that that comes true. So the first question is, why are we flailing? And I'll answer it this way. How many people here recall what they got on their SATs or their ACTs? And how many people have found that information to be useful in the years since then? These tests are in our DNA, right? The idea that there is a scientific person or guy or some system that's going to tell you something about yourself and how smart you are, everybody wants that. Every parent wants that about their kid. Every teacher wants that about their students. Every person who is thinking about a school wants to know that about the school students. So we have a real thirst for this kind of information. And we're willing to overlook the fact that the SAT isn't very useful. We're willing to overlook the fact that the IQ test isn't very useful. We still use the term IQ, even though it hasn't been useful for a really long time. And it's been demonstrated, by the way, there was a completely ignored study in the 1930s that I talk about in the book that showed that IQ was totally malleable with nurturing and enough investment, enough affection. Actually, it's a fantastic study, skills and die experiment. It was called the Wandering IQ Study, and it was laughed out of the hall because people didn't like the idea that IQ wasn't fixed, because IQ is fixed. That's the definition of IQ. It's fixed. Without addressing the need and the internal need for data and the internal starvation for success and information about our own kids' success, everybody wants that. So if you don't have a system that provides that, it's never going to gain any traction. And so I would just tell Arnie Duncan that he needs to be a little bit more rigorous about the science behind the instrument that he's designing. He doesn't have to give up the idea of data, but he has to give up the idea of a single test and all the stakes attached to it, because that's never going to be the way that we get. You can't get good information. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
You know, I want to just follow up with one thing. I'm
Yeah.
not sure that I would agree with you that we all want to have those assessments, the data that will tell us who we are. I think, and I worked in independent schools for a long time where parents were frantic about SAT scores and college placement and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But if I sat down and I said to them, how do you want to describe your child at 32? They want that person to be healthy.
Yeah.
And happy and doing something they love doing and making a difference.
Okay. So maybe we can talk about invoking short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. And yes, if you can get people to invoke that long-term thinking, they're going to think about it completely differently. And I think in some ways, I mean, I feel like my job as a parent is to instill a sense of self-worth in my own child where she's not depending on outside markers to tell her what kind of human being she really is. And yet, I feel like it's a very strong mode of thinking, and it is there in a lot of our memories and our minds that we remember that number that we got at 17.
Hi. So I grew up in Florida, and I taught in Florida for 8 years until my daughter was born, and we just moved here. So in Florida, I felt like I, as a teacher, was always playing catch up with the latest educational trend and finding out what our legislators were cooking up and what was going to be coming down the pike. And as much as I tried to inform myself, I always felt like I wasn't in the right loop to know, to be part of the discussion, right? Like I always wanted to actually be part of the discussion rather than just be angry about the result. But I never felt like I was ever invited to be part of the discussion, or I didn't know the right people. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, when you were researching the book, if you found any information about the level of, or the degree to which teachers have been involved in the creation of these tests, or the lack thereof, and, you know, why they haven't been. And I'm sure that I know that led to our frustration in Florida. So.
Yeah, great question. I think, I mean, it seems like running for school board is probably the answer in terms of you want to have a voice in the education and political process. And it's sad that more of it, I mean, I find it sad that more of it's not delegated to teachers as it should be. You're the professionals. That said, I mean, I was surprised to learn in the course of researching the book that psychometrics is really a profession unto itself. It belongs much more to the statisticians and the social scientists in general, well, the statisticians, let's say, than it does to the realm of learning science or cognition or pedagogy or any particular discipline of learning. You know, and it's a lineage, a short, small lineage and a really small handful of organizations, and it's always been thus. There's a handful of testing companies. There's always been a handful of testing companies, and they produce the tests.
Thank you.
Hi, I don't know if you already addressed this issue, but I'm a student here in D.C. I attended DCPS all my life, and a few people mentioned, especially the last woman, her question associated with how much teachers are involved in the creation of these tests. And for me, it's like my experience with DCPS is that, you know, my feeling towards the teachers and the teachers unions and those people that have a lot of influence when it comes to creating tests, I feel like, you know, they're going to be those people who don't want to hold teachers accountable for the results. So in your work researching this, how, you know, did you come across, you know, teachers who said, we don't like the testing because it's holding, you know, because it's holding people accountable? Or do you have, you know, is there back and forth about holding teachers accountable, or, you know, that issue there? So if you can answer that.
I want to thank you for coming out tonight, and thanks for your interest.
I actually work here.
Oh, well, there you go.
I was already here.
Then never mind. But thanks for listening anyway, and thanks for asking a question. And I hope you tell your classmates about it. Teachers unions that I know of, I mean, teachers unions have supported the Common Core up to a point. Teachers unions supported No Child Left Behind up to a point in my recollection. There hasn't been, no teacher has ever said to me, I don't want to be held accountable for my quality of my work. Teachers have said, I don't want to be held accountable for the quality of my work by a test that was created by someone who's not an educator and was sold to my school district and is not relevant or integrated to what I'm teaching. And that is an argument you'll hear quite a lot from teachers. And I think there's several in this room that could make that argument.
Thank you.
We have time for one more.
Okay.
Okay. A few weeks ago, the New York Times published an article about the education system in St. Louis. I don't know if you read this article, but as I sat there listening to it, it seems to me no matter what test they create, it would make a difference for a lot of students, because I think the missing factor is about class, which was well elaborated in Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, in which he spoke about how the class structure is now situated in the United States. We have a new upper class and we have a new lower class. And it seems to me a lot of children come to these classes lacking a lot of things that the state cannot fix. So standardized testing, it seems to me, will not save these children. You're going to continue to have a permanent underclass because these are class values. A lot of these parents have a lot of things going for them in the middle and upper classes that the lower class never will. So when the state is creating a test that it says equal for everybody, this is an illusion, it seems to me, and these lower class students are really not going to make it. And we know that, and yet we continue to present this notion that somehow the state and the federal government could come up with tests to make a difference for these students. It seems to me it really cannot be fixed. This is my position.
I mean, that's an interesting position. I guess I'm going to refer to a piece that I wrote for my colleagues at NPR about proficiency. No Child Left Behind. All children were supposed to be proficient by 2014 in No Child Left Behind. Spoiler alert, that did not happen. And so I called up a couple of people, including Sandy Kress, one of the architects of No Child Left Behind, and to talk about this. And it was a really fascinating conversation because basically, he said to me, like, well, what child do you want to leave behind? Who are we going to give up on, huh? And obviously, everybody, I mean, maybe not obviously, the phrase No Child Left Behind is stirring because it represents an ideal that I talked about at the beginning of this talk, which is we want equality of opportunity. We want to not forget about anyone and not think that anyone is doomed and not give up on anyone, and to offer people as many chances to succeed and as much opportunity to succeed as we can. But there's a really big gap between saying that's the aspiration and that is what we are all striving for, and saying we're all going to do that, and every child is going to achieve this marker by this year. And so when you try to translate that aspiration into a policy goal, you're going to run into some problems, and that seems to be the situation that we're in right now. And I really want to thank all of you for your attention and participation. And let's give a round of applause to the educators that came out tonight and the parents.